Hello. EUIC is coming up in just a couple of days by the time I'm putting this up. And if you know anything about me, I'm definitely playing Gardevoir for this event. And I think most of you should too. It's by far the best deck. I have the most options. But what I'm still not sure of is what cards I want to play. Because despite being in a format that has gone on for what feels like forever now, especially with Ascended Heroes being delayed, um, the decks that are good have been good for a while. But despite this, Gardevoir still kind of evolves and changes every set. Most of these lists are pretty different. We're not in the just post rotation era where everyone played the same lists. You got, I mean, immediately you can see the difference between the jelly lists and the non-jelly lists. But even just like within these straight Guardy lists, it's very rare that you'll see the exact same cards in all of them. And trying to decide which one is the best one is really hard. And so there's a lot of pros and cons between each of these builds. I'm going to go through those. Now, the deck that I think is the most generically strong is the list that I played to the Birmingham Regional Championships and got my top 8 with, which is this luxurious Cape Guard list. And the reason I think this list in particular is so good is that, I mean, all of these cards are basically good in almost every matchup. You're never feeling like, oh, my luxurious cape is completely dead, or I wish I didn't play 8 energy. Because these cards are just generically good cards. They're always going to be good. It's a very consistent list. It kind of does what it wants to do almost every game. It always sets up. It's got 2 Evos. Got 10 draw supporters. There's not much to complain about here. And I think that if you want the most even spread, this luxurious cape deck is going to give you options in every matchup, and almost all of your cards are going to be useful. You're never going to feel like, oh, this matchup's like totally terrible. I wouldn't say that you even have anything worse than a 40-60. Maybe you could argue you could maybe argue that Jelly is unfavored as that, but I think it's probably closer to 55-45 a lot of the time. Um, this is definitely the deck with the widest spread. You know, if you're expecting to play better than all of your opponents, I think this is definitely the deck to play because you've always got options. So it takes the most even matchup spread, and I think there's a lot to say for that, especially um, in a format as large in a tournament as large as this, where you know even though the best 4 decks are pretty clear, people play like a that there's a lot of different sort of other options that people have looked at, right? You've got all of these decks here, they're not together. They make up about the same as one of the big decks when you add these up together. And and the cave deck definitely gives you the widest matchup spread. You're totally fine sat across from Paul, Dengo, Mira. Cave gives you definitely the best shot into Dawn's Art. You're okay with hitting Grim. You're okay with hitting Absol Box. You're definitely happy with all of these. There's nothing that you're like really upset about hitting. So if you want to just trust that you're going to play better than your opponents, or think that the meta is going to be very wide for this event, I think this is definitely the deck to play. Now, a deck that I have been considering pretty strongly in in this for this tournament is it is the Flutter Mane list, and it's actually only 2 cards different. The only difference is you cut the eight energy, and you cut the luxurious cape for Flutter Mane and Diva. Um, and this is definitely more of a meta call deck. You can't say that this is these 2 tech cards are going to be useful in every matchup in the way that 8 energy is a consistency increase, and the luxurious cape can always be a bravery charm. You can't say that about Flutter and Devo. So you're definitely centralizing your matchups a little bit more. So if you feel like you've got a really good read on the meta, and you're expecting a lot of like Grimmsnarl, maybe even Jelly Guardy and Absol, and I think the Flutter Mane is a really good call if that's what you're expecting because um, it gives you a lot more weighted matchups. Like you feel like you're taking a lot more like 65-35s with this list than the Cape list, I think. Um, yeah. I mean, it also gives you like a surprise factor, right? There's definitely something to be said in those early rounds where if people are trying to play around the Cape build and they're like, okay, how do I create like a more single prize board to play around the the Cape two price knockouts. If you then hit them with a Flutter Mane, that's going to be a shock, right? But I think the main thing is if you're trying to like centralize for like a really good placement and either have like a bad run or a really good run, I think the Flutter Mane is a slightly better deck for that. If you're expecting, these dark decks to be really good and these matchups the Flutter Mane is really good into, if you want to say, okay, I think that these decks are going to do well at this tournament, and I either want to have a bad tournament or a really good tournament, I think Flutter Mane is a great call for that because these spread options are really good into any of these other spread. Like against Grimmsnarl, if you can just Devo them, the deck just kind of breaks, right? Like they only play one candy now, so it's really strong in that matchup. Um, and then the Flutter Mane against Absol, you can Mew punch their Absol, discard a card from their hand. And on the following turn, I own them to like what, two or three, use Flutter Mane to KO Absol. Kangaskhan can't draw cards, you've got a single prize in the active. That's really strong. So I think I think more importantly, just on a general basis, is that these cards like Flutter Mane and Devo are very matchup specific, right? It's not always going to be useful. But, it's very rare that the Flutter Mane is completely dead, but you'll have matchups where the Devo just is a completely dead card. And I think that's fine if you feel like you've got a really strong read on the meta. Another way to approach just one of these straight guardy builds would be to play just Diancie. Um, Again, it's like I guess every card in this is almost always going to be good, right? Like second Charm, you're more consistently just having simple cards like Charm, and then the Diancie again is a different way to approach the matchups like Grim or Absol. Um, in that I don't know, it's like it's not wicked to argue. You put a massive Pokemon in the active, can they even kill it? Um, I think that one of the strengths of this sort of like Diancie list that I've got here is that it's very simple. Um, you've got like a massive guy that hits for a big number. You don't really have to worry. It's less resistant to like, oh, I prize my screen tail. I can never hit the big numbers. It's like a very simple deck in Gardevoir standards, right? There's not a lot of tricks going on here. You kind of know what you're trying to do. Very good, simple tricks, just like no tricks, Guardy deck. Um, but you do give yourself, that wider spread where like the Diancie is really good into those dark decks. Like even if you hit like a Zoroark, if you were scared of that, for example, if you thought suddenly, oh, Zoroark's gonna be really good for this tournament. Now, I don't think that personally, but if you feel like you're the meta genius, there's definitely an argument to play the Diancie for that matchup. And I think but yeah, the more important thing when you look at all these three straight Guardy lists is that, they're all 58 cards the same. And I think that more important than the specific matchups each card is good into, I think that when you're preparing for the tournament in these last few days, trying to decide the last couple cards of your list, um, I think that actually the goal of what you want your list to do is much more important than the matchups in terms of if you want to like always give yourself the best opportunity to make the best of the tournament of what matches are put in front of you, you want to pick a deck with like a wider matchup spread like this Cape deck. Or if you want to centralize your matchups a little bit more and say, okay, I want to take more like 70-30s and less 50-50s, and maybe you'll gain like a 30-70 along the way. Like the Dawn's Odd matchup. I don't think it's that bad, but the Dawn's Odd matchup is definitely really bad for this for the Flutter Mane build because you can't Devo them because then they pick up their Noctowls, and it's like, but if you feel like you have a really good meta read, that's when you start to play these more techie cards. Gardevoir can be any deck, so the most important thing going into a tournament is deciding what decks do I want to beat. And like this is the only difference between any of those lists. These are the only like six cards that you could put in any of those slots for those straight go lists that I've looked at there. You know, the one that just won in Santiago, I think. This list definitely is very different in terms of this play Drifloon, Watchtower, but they had to cut one CC for it, right? So if you play Drifloon and Watchtower, three stadiums, um, you're spreading yourself quite thin, right? You're losing cards that are good in every matchup, like Countercatcher. You're losing Turo, the generically good cards. and you're spreading yourself quite thin. And I think that's one of the weaknesses that Gardevoir can have. You can beat anything, but you have to choose what to beat. Because if you try and tech for every, in a wide meta, if you try and have individual techs for everything, you run out of space for consistency. And that's why the Flutter Mane sort of approach to building your deck, and the Flutter Mane deck in general, it's a lot better in these smaller metas. Sort of expect what you can expect, like the same four decks to always be the most played by a lot because okay, I want to include Flutter Mane and Devo because they're really good in those three specific matchups, and they'd be less good in a wider meta. Whereas these Turbo Guardy decks, like the Cape deck or even the Diancie deck, somewhat um, are useful tools in every matchup. So the wider the meta is, the more different decks you can play against. The better these just like charm, I'm going to blow up the active or blow up even the bench if you're talking about Screamtail. Those decks are a lot better when you're in a wider meta. Obviously, something we haven't looked at yet is the Jellicent lists, and I think that there's definitely an argument for these as well in terms of it's definitely easier to. These are good decks for tournaments, right? If you just item lock your opponent and they brick, you're not really worried about that in a tournament. Uh, having those easy scam games where you get to item lock your opponents and and they draw terrible is a very good feeling in a tournament that maybe it wouldn't be in like a friendly game. Um, but I think the strengths to the obviously the Jellicent is another card where like it's good in a lot of matchups. I think if I were to play a Jellicent build, I would focus on one of these builds that still plays Evo because I think especially for this event specifically at EUIC, I'm expecting a lot of Dragapult, which is where I've always liked the double research. I would expect a lot of Dragapult because Europe players like Dragapult, big events like this. I mean, Dragapult's just always going to do well. It's the most popular deck, basically. So I probably want to play this Evo build instead of the Latias Thin Guardy line. I think that sometimes with these Latias lists, you end up focusing too much on the Jellicent and not enough on the Gardevoir. Like you can see here with the 3 Nest Ball, a 2-1-2 Guardy line, you're sacrificing a lot of the strength of being a Gardevoir deck to instead just like focus on this Jellicent card. And Jellicent's really strong, um, but why would you want to be a Jellicent deck over the best deck that's basically ever been printed in Gardevoir? I think that sometimes the Latias decks can lose that. And I think this is a very good deck, and it's very good at getting the turn 1 item lock, turn 2 hand attached to Jellicent, and just power press, if that's what you want to do. But it is worse at being a general Gardevoir deck like that. And I think, especially looking at this tournament, just being Gardevoir seems very well positioned to me. Um, yeah, that's probably the jelly list that I'd be looking at playing. But you can see the problem with this list is that it has that problem spreading itself too thin, trying to account for a wider meta. Like, I want the Air Balloon for that turn 1 item lock. I need the Evo for Dragapult. I want Devo so that I like have a it's a really good game plan into Dengo and also gives you more options into Charizard. Because with the Jellicent, the Devo's a lot stronger because they can't just like easily knock over candy. They need the boss as well. So um, and the Devo's just like a very good card in Jellicent versus like that. So sort of, and then I also want the Diancie so that I have an option to Absol. You can see that by playing all these cards, you lose cards like Turo, you lose second counter catcher. And the other options that a lot of Jesuits do is they start to cut into these supporters. And if you cut your supporter counter, your deck just stops functioning, right? You might have theoretically much stronger matchups, but you know, you'll start to have games where you just don't play at all a lot more often. And that's usually a more important thing to be doing than teching for specific matchups. But if I were to play Jelly, I think I'd probably play something like this list. Maybe second counter catcher you could play instead of the Diancie. So that's again just depends on what matchups you're expecting. Um, but yeah, some kind of straight guard list is definitely what I'm choosing to play for this event. But the main thing before you decide your list is just how do you want to approach the tournament? Because if you feel like you've got a really strong meta read and you want to get like a super high up top placement, picking decks based on decks that you think are going to do well, like maybe not decks that you think are going to be the most popular, but if you think that an unpopular deck, for let's use an example, if suddenly, now it's not, but if suddenly you thought Terror Box is going to be like a 4% deck, but it's going to be all over the top tables and you want a top result, you might want to play a version that's good into Terror Box. Now, I don't think that's applicable to this event at UIC, but it's a good way to think about how to choose your deck going forward. Um, but yeah, the generically strongest deck is definitely this LuxCape deck because it gives you widest array of options for sure. And if you're interested in more about this deck, I think the only place to go, the best place to look for a good guide on this deck is you can find my guide about the deck on Metafy. It's like 8,000 words at this point. So thank you and good luck at EUIC.